Hello and welcome to our webinar, Creating a Plan for Cluster Research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. We are a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. I also want to note that we are, of course, broadcasting from our homes with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience and for bearing with us. Even if we do lose the connection on our end, not to worry, you will still have an access to a full recording on our website. So our instructor today is Lindsay Fulton, Director of Research Services here at American Ancestors. Lindsay joined the Society in 2012, first as a member of the Research Services team and then as a genealogist in our library. She has been the Director of Research Services since 2016. In addition to helping constituents with their research, Lindsay has also authored a portable genealogist on the topics of applying to lineage societies, the United States Federal Census 1790 to 1840, and the United States Federal Census 1850 to 1940. She is a frequent contributor to the NEHGS blog Vita Brevis and has appeared as a guest on the Extreme Genes radio program. Her areas of interest are New England and New York research with a focus on lineage society applications. So, as with all family history research, at some point, you hit a brick wall. You can't find your ancestors' parents, their origins, a woman's maiden name, etc. Whatever the case may be, cluster research can help. And today, Lindsay will explain what we mean by cluster research and how a research plan can help you stay on task. She will demonstrate how to create and maintain such a plan using a case study from her own family. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the panel on the right of your screen. We'll address those after the presentation. There is a handout for this session that can be purchased from our online store. You'll find a link to this item in your reminder emails as well as in your follow-up email after today's broadcast. I've also put that in the chat panel. I'll include it on the website. So if you don't already have the handout and you're interested in purchasing that, you'll find it in a variety of locations. But we are also recording this program, and starting tomorrow, you can freely go back and review any of the content from today's presentation on our website. Those are all archived. Our webinars are all archived and free and available on our website as well. So if you missed something, in today's first listen, don't worry, you can always review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Ginevra, and welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about creating a research plan using cluster research. Now, we're going to go over what cluster research means, but the reason that we're going to talk about this is that I would recommend using this technique once you've exhausted all of the resources and records for your direct ancestor. So this is when you start to notice that you're going down a rabbit hole or looking at shiny objects or hitting brick walls. This is a technique that's worked for us before in research services, and it will focus your energy and looking at the right people rather than going down the rabbit holes or looking at those shiny objects. So what is cluster research? Cluster research is a research technique employed by genealogists to learn more about an ancestor by examining records left by the ancestor's cluster, or what we call the fan club. A person's cluster consists of extended family, neighbors, and associates. The associates can be friends or business partners. And researching the lives of an ancestor's cluster can lead to a more complete and a more accurate picture of that ancestor's life. The first part of the cluster, and really the easiest to identify, is the family. So So family members, one of the reasons they're so easy to find is that they're usually the people with the same surname as your ancestor, but that's not always the case. Just as in your own family, I'm sure, you know, those that come over for Thanksgiving dinner or for parties, when we could have parties, would consist of people with maiden names of a spouse, in-laws, cousins, that could be first cousins or maybe even second or third cousins, grandparents, great-grandparents, and then step-parents and siblings. And the step-parents and siblings is really important because those folks are going to spend a lot of time with your direct ancestor, especially if your ancestor gets married once or twice. Those people are very important, and they're definitely going to have a different surname than your ancestor. So those are important people to take note of. Some of the reasons that we like to research family members is that it can help us determine parentage. That is the #1 reason we start looking at other family members. It can help us with maiden names, and it can help us with the names of mom and dad. These records can also help us to discover origins of immigrant ancestors. So I'm sure that some of you have done research before where, for example, you're looking for your Irish ancestors, and everyone just keeps saying over and over and over that they're from Ireland. Well, if you start to look at some other family members, someone may slip up and give us some more information than just Ireland at some point. Another reason to look at family members is to locate information about a parent's birthplace. So cluster research is really just like regular genealogical research. You're going to keep doing the same thing that you've always been doing. So you're going to look for cemetery records and census records and church records and so on. Except now you're going to look at them slightly differently. You're not just looking for your direct ancestor, you're looking for other individuals as well. So if you're looking at census records, we want to be looking at all of the people enumerated in the household. We want to look at the birthplaces of those people. We want to note other households in the area with the same surname or those with similar professions. If we're looking at church records, we want to think about admissions to the church or witnesses to a baptism or a marriage. If we're looking at city directories, we want to look at other households with the same surname that are living in the same, maybe on the same street, in the same town, in the same city. You want to look for individuals with the same profession. If you're looking at local histories and genealogies, you might be thinking about a list of earlier or prominent settlers, individuals with similar origins, or individuals with the same surname or the same vital information and genealogical information. If you're looking at land records, something to keep in mind is those who have been buying and selling land from each other over and over and over again, especially if they have the same surname or the same maiden name as one of your ancestors. If there's a large amount of land that's sold for just a little bit of money, or if someone sells a part of land and they use the phrase in consideration of love and affection, those can be key indicators that those are other family members, even if they don't have the same surname. Naturalization records, those can help. We want to be paying attention to individuals with similar birth dates or surnames, individuals with similar occupations. Some of the more recent naturalization records, so the 20th, 19th century, 20th century naturalization records, might provide the address of the individual, so someone that's living at that same address, as well as witnesses that we might see over and over. In terms of newspaper articles, we want to be, I think what we tend to look for in newspaper articles are obituaries or maybe marriage announcements to start with. But some of those 19th and 20th century newspapers will provide information about, like in a society section. So who's traveling, who's visiting from another place, that might be included, or who's going on a trip. Probate records, we want to pay attention to the wills that are listing heirs or administrators. And we always want to look at the entire probate record. So when I say probate records, I always mean something other than, wills, but I also mean other items as well, such as a division of an estate or an administration. So the division of estate might list heirs, even though a relationship's not included. And then another key point to look at are the debts and credits for that particular account. And they're going to list individuals' names on there. Those are also important people. Those are people who would be part of your ancestors cluster. And then finally, town records. We want to be looking for other individuals or families who arrived in that area at the same time, as well as individuals and families with the same surname who might be included in those town records. So that's another, those are the key things to look for in those key resources when we're talking about family members. The next group who are harder to identify are the associates. And the associates can be folks who are interested in the same politics or have the same occupation. Occupation can be a little difficult, especially if your ancestor was a farmer or a laborer, because there's going to be many farmers and many laborers that are in a particular town, county, or a neighborhood. But if you have an ancestor who has a skilled occupation like teacher, blacksmith, lawyer, or if they were in the same industry like shoemakers or boat builders or weavers, all of those people are part of your ancestors' associates. We want to also think about those who go to the same church or that are part of the same parish. They're not going to have the same surname and they might not be family members, but they're going to tell us a lot about our ancestor. The same is true for associated places. So your ancestor might share the same place of birth as others in a neighborhood or a town. This is most effective when we're looking for where a person came from. Or if we're thinking about death details, for example, did your ancestor die in a battle? Or maybe they died during an accident? If so, others likely died in that place too. If we research those individuals, you're going to learn a lot more about your ancestors' life or the end of their life, and maybe bring you back to learn some more information about their family and where they came from. So the number one reason that I always say it's important to research associates is that it helps with tracing migration. That's one of the big ones. But what it really does is it rounds out that person's life. We learn so much more about their biography when we're looking at the associates. We learn, what their politics might have been, or if they served in the military. We learn more than just what we're looking for commonly as genealogists, that birth, marriage, and death information. Now we learn, more about their biography and what it was like for them to live in that particular historic period. The key resources to look at, and again, these are things that you've looked at before, I'm sure, when you've been researching your own ancestor. But now we're going to look at things slightly differently. So if we're looking at church records or church bulletins, we want to be paying attention to who the pastors are, or the priest, or the rabbi, or the minister. So who's serving your ancestor's parish or congregation? Who are the witnesses to the religious events in your ancestor's life? If someone's baptized, if someone gets married, who are those witnesses that are included? Godparents are important. Individuals and families that belong to the same church organization, those are also part of your ancestors cluster. When we're looking at yearbooks and school records, we want to think about those who graduated in the same class. But then if we want to narrow that down more, we want to think about those who are on the same sports team or in clubs. Or if you have the original yearbook of your ancestor, maybe you look at who signed their yearbook. And we also want to take into consideration the teachers and the professors that are there at the time, because they would have played a role in your ancestors' education and their life. Census and city directories, that's going to help us to identify those with similar professions, as well as employees and owners of institutions where your ancestors worked. If they're into politics, we want to think about who they supported. They might have also been loyalists. So during the American Revolution, If they were loyal to the crown, they might have been settling a new area with a group of other loyalists. So those people are important and part of your ancestors cluster. And finally, the county and local histories. You want to think about if your family has been in the same place for several generations, you want to think about the other people who have done the same thing. If your family did not do that and they've migrated from somewhere, you want to think about the other people that did the same thing, because that's going to help you bring them back to another location. The final group of people that we're going to think about are the neighbors. And neighbors can be a little bit easier to identify as well, because they're usually listed, they're enumerated, especially in census records, or if we're talking about city directories, they're always going to be listed along with your ancestor, so that they're a little bit easier to find out. We want to be thinking about household neighbors, so like I was saying with census and city directories. But I also want to be thinking about the forever neighbors of your ancestors, and that's when they are buried in a cemetery. You want to be thinking about the surrounding plots, or even those that are included in the exact same cemetery where they're living, because those folks are part of a larger neighborhood. The reasons that we want to look at neighbors. It helps us to understand much more about migration patterns. Those that are living in the same neighborhood, it was very common for our ancestors to come from a different place. So if they're Irish or Italian or Canadian, doesn't matter. Most likely that there was a group of people who came at one point. They figured out where their neighborhood should be, and then they would write back home and then tell people that, you know, life is good here and there's jobs and there's a place for you to live, and then more would arrive. So it's very important to look at that neighborhood even before your ancestor arrives. It's also going to supply missing information about our ancestors and can help to reveal maiden names. So when we're looking at our key resources, we want to also be thinking about the neighbors that are involved. If you're looking at military pensions, if you've been lucky enough to find a military pension for your own ancestor, I want you to look at it for the affidavits of the fellow soldiers that are included in there, or maybe even witnesses that are providing testimony. So there were many times where a birth record couldn't be found or procured from the town clerk because they weren't recording it at that point, or the veteran didn't have their discharge papers, in which case they would use the affidavits of their neighbors and also the gentlemen that are serving with them to prove that their service was real and that they should be getting a pension. In those cases, those people are very important. You can also search other people's pension records for your own ancestor, because your own ancestor might have provided an affidavit for another soldier. If you're looking at town records, again, I want you to be looking at families that arrive in the town at the same time. If you're looking at really old town records, and you're looking at those proprietor lists, maybe in New England, I want you to think about all of those people that are included on there, because that's a tight-knit community that is creating a new town. So they would have been, very aware of the others who were in the area. And that might lead to more information about family members or helping to fill out that biography of your ancestor's life. I've even seen on those early town records some plot maps that can show, the plot that your ancestor was given and then who's living next door. If you're looking at diaries and daybooks, sometimes, so you're not always going to find a diary or a daybook that has specifically to do with your ancestor, so your ancestor didn't write it, but that doesn't matter. What we want to pay attention to is what community is a diary or a daybook writing about? And is your ancestor living in that community at that time? Because if you have a busybody who's including all that information in a diary, you might get information about your ancestor directly. They might indirectly or directly named your ancestor, but you'll also know about what the community was like. a very important part of the research process. If you're looking at church records, I want you to pay attention to the pew rentals. So some early churches will provide either maps or like almost a census of the pew rentals and who is going to be worshiping near your ancestor. And then also those nearby cemetery and burial plots. And then finally, probate records. When you're looking at probate records, just as I had said before, we should be looking at the debit and credits, as well as who the administrator is, who's the bondsman. If they had to take an inventory, who were those individuals? They're usually going to be the neighbor of your ancestor. Okay, so now we know who the fan is. We know who the ancestors cluster is. We're going to talk about how to look at these records in an organized way. And this can be kind of complicated because you're going to be looking at many individuals, because the cluster will grow very quickly once you start to identify records for your own ancestor and then who that cluster is based on those particular records. So step one is organizing everything that you have done previously into what I like to call an annotated research log. It is just a fancy name for a spreadsheet. So this is an example of an annotated research log. This is a template that I've created. This is something that we use in research services. And what it does is it allows you to record each of your ancestors. So you can do that here in this column. And then allows you to put the dates that you examined, as well as whether or not you found a relevant record. And then also this note section. The note section is very important because it allows you to put information in that maybe doesn't fall into these particular columns set before that. A nice part of the annotated research log is that it allows you so much flexibility. You can create as many columns as you like and as many rows as you like. I think within reason, but I'm sure that it's probably around 1 million that it would allow. So just keep that in mind, that you always have flexibility whenever you're working on this particular research log. So I want you to fill all of that out for your particular ancestor. And when we're moving forward, you should be using different tabs for more than one family. So I'll show you an example here. So this is what I like to do when I'm working on a particular line of yours. So these are my grandparents here, who I've designated as generation 1. So Laura L. Brown is my grandmother, and William J. Fulton is my grandfather. So I'm including the two of them as a couple on their own sheet. So all of the information that I have for Laura L. Brown and William J. Fulton should be on this particular tab of this sheet. Then for tab number 2, these are my great-grandparents. So they're the parents of Laura Brown, Chester Brown, and Clara Wharton. I also have a separate Excel file of looking at the Fulton side of the family. So I reverse these two individuals. So I put William J. Fulton underscore Laura L. Brown. So then I know that that particular file is going to be looking just at the Fultons. And then this one is going to be looking just at the Browns. This is just a way that I like to organize it for myself. And the reason that I do so is once we start doing cluster research, I create an entirely new file just for, so say that we were running into a brick wall with Laura and we couldn't figure out who her parents were. I would create an entirely new one just for her cluster. So everyone that's going to be included in these tabs would be potential family members or associates or neighbors. And I'll show you an example of that when we're going forward. Again, this is just what has worked for me. So if this gets too complicated at any point and you want to change things up, that's totally fine. Now, you might be thinking, oh, Lindsay, I'm going to have 1 million of these tabs if I keep doing that. Well, the nice part about Excel is that it allows you this toggle opportunity. So if you go all the way to the left, you can right click and then see all the sheets. And then I'll show you what the example looks like And this is just something that I put together for my own ancestors. So you can see here when I open that up that I can see all of the generations that I've identified so far for the Brown family. And then you can, if you just click on one of those, it will open up that particular sheet. So if you wanted to fill, so if you were doing a cluster study, you might have all sorts of people listed here. So, you know, further down the sheet, and you can just click on those and then toggle back and forth. So once you have all of the information updated on your research log, then you're going to start looking for missing information. So in this case, we're going to be looking for my second great-grandfather. His name was Emmanuel Henry Brown, and he married a woman named Alice Baker. So what I did was I filled out as best I could all of the information that I had for Emmanuel Henry Brown. So far, I don't have birth records for either Emmanuel or his wife, Alice. So I put that in this relevant record section. I do have a death record for Emmanuel Henry Brown. It's on the 25th of June, 1904. It's in Jeffersonville, Wayne County, Illinois. And I put yes in this column. In the notes field, I include what I find to be relevant information coming from that death record. So I'm telling you that it's a transcription of the original, which isn't good. You should always get a copy of the original. And that's why I'm including that it's a transcription, because it's letting me know I need to do more work. The death record also says that he's buried in Buckeye Cemetery, and that he's not included in a book that I've been using, this Wayne County, Illinois Cemetery Inscriptions, Volume 2. He's not included in that. So I just want to remind myself of that information. In the objective column, where we're saying this is why we're doing what we're doing, we're trying to find the parents of Emmanuel Henry Brown. And on the death record, I'm going to say no parents are included, because that's what I'm most interested in at this point in time. So I'm including that information there. So even though my objective always is discover the parents of Emmanuel Henry Brown, discover the parents of Emmanuel Henry Brown, whenever you find a record, you want to update what you were able to find here. And then there's a spot for citations. I like to do a full citation, similar to what I would include in a research report, but that's really up to you. I just want you to be able to go find it again. So be as detailed as you can. It's time consuming, I understand, but you will thank yourself in the long run when you don't have to go running back to find it for a third, fourth, or fifth time. We're going to do the same with all of, so I wanted to be able to show you all, because this can get very large and hard to read very quickly. So these are all of the entries for Emmanuel Henry Brown and Alice, sometimes known as Allie Baker. So I have all of the records that I found for him, I'm going to include all those on there. So we have them on the 1850, 60, 70, 80, and 1900 census. So again, including the information about who's living in the household, the reason that we're looking at these particular individuals, and then what my citation is for it. And then finally, further on down the sheet, we're going to be talking about some of the obituaries that we tried to find. And we did find an obituary for Emmanuel Brown, and it did provide some great information. And I just did a cut and paste job here, and I moved the text from that particular obituary to this annotated research log. I'm also highlighting in red the people that I find interesting, but that's what we're going to talk about in our next step. So our main goal, so the hard goal, because everyone always says, well, we're going to find parents. Well, in this case, we're going to try to find Emmanuel Henry Brown's mother's name. So we want to build our research plan based on the records that we already have for Emmanuel. So we already have these relevant records that we know are him. We know that this 1904 death record is him. We know the 1904 obituary is for him, and those census records are relevant to him as well. So now that we've identified everything that we have identified all of the records that we found along the way when we were researching for Emmanuel. We've put them all on our research log. So now we need to figure out who the fan club is. So who's part of my ancestors cluster? So we're going to return to those key resources. And you should be doing this for any key resource that you have for your ancestor. Anything where you know that is definitely my guy or my gal on that record, that's what you're going to use to discover who the fan club is. So if you have a city directory or a census or a pension, whatever it might be, you're going to tear it apart, make sure that you haven't left any stone unturned, and locate all of the individuals that you need to be researching going forward. I'm not talking about the best candidates. I'm talking about all of them. They should all be included on your research plan, because if you don't put them on your research plan, you will forget about them. And you might, if you're not methodical with this process, you will be upset with yourself going forward, because when you're methodical, that's when you start to notice some patterns that you might not have noticed before. Or again, like I said, someone slips up at some point and gives us more information than they intended on doing, which is great for us, because then we can answer the question that we're looking for. So even if it seems like an obscure connection, still is worth putting on your research log. I want you to consider when you're looking at those key resources, just to reiterate, people living at the same address, people who were born in the same place and they're now living together in the same place, people with the same occupation. Again, that's difficult when we're talking about farmers or laborers. But if it's a skilled occupation, that's important. Or if it's in a particular manufacturing item, that would also be important, like linen or shoemaking. Neighbors that are listed on tax records or deeds, as well as witnesses to estates, deeds, marriage records, or naturalizations. So now we're going to walk through who Emmanuel Henry Brown's fan club is. So who's his cluster? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to review everything that we already have for him. So first, the 1904 death record. This is the transcription. See, it's terrible. It's not giving us very much information. Hey, it's something, but it's not what we would really like. So there's no parents listed. There's no spouse. There's no informant. But there's still information on here that's important that can help us get to some parts of the fan club. And that's that he's buried in Buckeye Cemetery. So who else is buried in Buckeye Cemetery? There's a feature on Find a Grave, and this can be used on several of the cemetery databases. But there's a way to just look at the Buckeye Cemetery memorials. And at this point I said, let's just look for people with the surname of Brown. Well, there's 11 Browns in Buckeye. There's Alice Baker Brown, who's his wife. So we already knew about her. There's Emmanuel Henry Brown, which we know who he is. That's who we're examining at the moment. But there's also a few Elizabeth Browns. So there's Elizabeth Brown dying in 1849, Elizabeth Brown dying in 1879, Elzariah dying in 1844, James Brown, 1895, John Brown, and so on. So all of those people, those 9 Browns that we didn't know about before, very important, they go on our research log, because then we know we have to look at them at some point. And when you're putting them on your research log, you have to indicate that the reason that you know about them is because they were buried in Buckeye Cemetery. Next step, the 1904 obituary. It was really beat up, so I just transcribed it for you. But this is what was in the Wayne County Recorder. Mr. Emmanuel Brown of Jeffersonville died at the home of his son, John Brown. Great. That's part of his cluster. 77. He's born in Ohio. not great. We wish we had a more specific location in Ohio, but he comes to Wayne County in 1845. So we would be interested going forward in all of the other people that arrive in 1845 who are coming from Ohio. That's a pretty deep dive, but those are important people as well. He marries Alice Baker. We already knew about that. He has 11 children. Well, that's new information. So the 11 children, we need to identify who all of them are. 6 of them have already died. There's also included on here a brother, Joseph. He survives. Fantastic. So he's definitely a person that we want to look for. And also finally indicates that he has a second wife, Eliza Ann, who's known as Lizzie. Her maiden name is Dean. They were married in 1894, which is excellent. So we can find that marriage record maybe going forward. But this is also part of his cluster. So he has 2 wives who are his family members. He has a son, John Brown, who's listed, along with 11 other, so 10 other children, and then also Joseph Brown. And if we're trying to find parents, Joseph Brown is a person we want to really pay attention to, because that's going to help us to maybe identify who those people are. So it's okay to look at Joseph Brown first. I'm just saying you need to put everyone on the research log that could be a potential family member or an associate or a neighbor, because if you strike out with Joseph, then you have to go back and look who those people are. Okay, so we've looked at the death record, we looked at the obituary. Now we're going to look at the census records that we have for them. So this is the very lovely looking census record. We have the Browns. I'm sorry, we have the Browns here. Emmanuel is just listed here as M. Brown. He's born in 1829 in Ohio. Allie is listed with him. Now this is the 1850 census, so it doesn't identify how the people in the household are related to each other. So you're going to have to do a little detective work to figure out how they're related to each other. But you should be paying attention to William Henry Brown, who's here. He's born in Illinois in January of 1850. And then also Thomas Brown. Thomas Brown is also included in that household. He's 10 years old. He's born in Ohio. So maybe that's a brother or a cousin of Emmanuel Brown. Again, someone we want to look at. Thomas is important. So now we have a potential Thomas brother, and then also we know Joseph is his brother. Then we move on to the 1860 census. At this point, there are a ton of people living in this household. So we still have Emmanuel Brown here, listed with his wife. She's listed as Allie, and then William Henry Brown, also, who was on the previous census. But now we have Francis, born in 1852 in Illinois, Ruth, born 1854 in Illinois, John Brown, born 1856 in Illinois, Millard Brown, 1858, Louisa Brown, 1859, and then we also have a Maria Sims, who's listed as a servant, and she's born in Pennsylvania in 1834. Now, she's not, she doesn't have the same surname. She doesn't have a name that we know. So Sims is not a name that was, it's not Baker, so it's not mom's maiden name. So she could be just an associate of this family, or she could be a family member. Still an important person to keep tabs on. So all of those people should go on your research plan. We're going to move forward to 1870. I know that this is not boring, but we want to methodically go through all of these census records to make sure that we're gathering all of the people that will be important to Emmanuel's cluster. So there's going to be people that are listed over and over again. So Emmanuel Brown is listed here with Allie. And then further on down the page are his other ancestors. There's still William, Francis, Ruth, John, Millard, Louisa, Emmanuel, and Julia. But now we have also John Brown, who was born in 1835 in Ohio. So again, perfect age to be a brother of Emmanuel. So John is going to be someone important going forward as well. We want to keep adding people to that research plan along the way, but John will be important. In 1880, we see Emmanuel again with Alice. This shows that Francis is living there, and the 1880 census is lovely because it gives us actual relationships. So you see here, now we finally get the relationships of the households. We have wife, son, daughter, for all of those individuals. So now we know, however, everyone is related to each other. Now, everyone that's included in this particular household is either a son or a daughter or a spouse. So not, it would have been better if they started this asking of that question for the relationships in 1870, but that's okay. So in 1880, we get some of the same information, which is fine, but we want to make sure that we look at everything. And then by 1900, Emmanuel is now living with his second wife. So it says that Emmanuel was born in Ohio in 1830, that he's living with Lizzie, and he's also there with his granddaughter. And his granddaughter is listed as Bessie Molt. So here they are here. Another lovely part of the 1900 and the 1880 census is that it provides information about parentage. So we know from the census record that dad might have been born in Ireland and mom might have been born in Pennsylvania, at least in terms of Emmanuel. Now, what's interesting about that is if we remember back to the 1850 census, nope, the 1860 census, there was a Maria Sims who was listed as the servant in the household. She's born in 1834 in Pennsylvania. So now I'm more intrigued by Maria Sims because of this information that's included in this census record. So we're going to set up our research log based on all of that information. So everyone that we just tried to find. So we're going to look for, so Emmanuel Brown listed here. So now all of the tabs here, this is a new sheet. So I started an entirely new Excel file for this. So this is Emmanuel Brown's cluster. So it starts with Elizabeth. Remember, they're the ones that are buried in Buckeye Cemetery. Same with Eliza, James, so on and so forth. But I want you to set that whole thing up. So all of the people that you're going to look for are all there at the same time. And remember, you still have that toggle feature. So I know you're thinking, Lindsay, this is way too many people. But if you have the toggle feature, then you can look back and forth to say, oh yeah, I already looked at them, or oh yes, I want to look at Maria Sims or Bessie Molt or whoever you decided was most important. But again, put them all on there, because if you don't, you'll forget. So once we've identified who the fan is and we've set up all of those different tabs, now we need to find the records, or we're going to list the records that are going to help us in this process. And again, we're trying to find Emmanuel's mom's name. So there's specific records that are going to help us with this. So there's all sorts of records that you can look at as a genealogist, but there's specific records that will help us with parents' names. So this is a lovely chart that's available on our website, on our Getting Started subject guide. And it can help you to narrow down what you want to be looking for. So if we're trying to find parents' names, this is what we want to do. We want to look at vital records, census records, probate records, newspapers, published genealogies. If that doesn't work, then we're going to move on to immigration records. But we really want to start with vitals, census, and probate, newspapers, and published genealogies. That's the records that we search first. So when we're setting up our research log, all of those records should be included. So this is your game plan. So this is the tab for Elizabeth Brown, who was one of the first people that we found in Buckeye Cemetery. So we know from her Find the Grave Memorial, which we're including here as the citation, we know that she died in 1849, and that she was born on the 22nd of April, 1830. We know that she's the wife of William P. Brown. So we should be able to find a birth record, or I should say a death record. We should be able to find maybe a death record. The federal census records, she should be on the 30 and the 40 census, even though she won't be named directly. We also want to find potentially a obituary for her, and maybe a published genealogy. But what we want to do is we want to find the resources. So do these resources even exist? So this is in a perfect world. In a perfect world, we would find newspaper and vitals and all sorts of stuff for Elizabeth. But we want to find out if we can actually do that. So now we got to find the resources. Here's a few places to look. I like to say it's a good idea to be looking at library catalogs for how-to books, or books that are about a specific record collection. So what are Illinois County marriages like? You can search on these library catalogs for that specific item. And the lovely part about our library catalog is that if there's a possibility that the book is digitized in any format, we have a link to that record once you click on the catalog entry. I also recommend using WorldCat. This is one of my favorite things to use. It's a worldwide catalog of the record of the library books that exist that participate in this particular database. But you can just put something in here, and you can do an everything search, or you can look by book or by article. I usually just use the everything search. And once you get a hit on that particular item, you can then put in your zip code, and it will tell you the closest library that has that particular item. And some libraries will participate in interlibrary loan, so that might be another way of you getting hold of some of these how-to books to help you figure out if the resources exist. There's also many ebook that exist in this world. HathiTrust, Google Books, Archive.org, Open Library. Family Search has an incredible collection of books that are available for free as long as you sign up for a Family Search account. So all of these items they could be available on the World Wide Web. If you're striking out with books, there's a few other places that you can look, and this is honestly, these are the first places that I go before I start looking for a hard copy book, if I don't already know about it. So the first is the subject guides that we have on our site on AmericanAncestors.org. These have been done by our expert genealogists about a variety of topics. I mentioned one about getting started. That's where you'll find that lovely chart that I still use to this day to help me kind of keep my focus and be looking for the correct records. But there are also ones that are available for specific record groups or specific people. So here's an example just of one that we did on Irish genealogy. It was done by Marie Daly, who is the senior genealogist at the Society. She retired a few years ago, but she was the best at explaining how to do the difficult work that comes with doing Irish genealogy. So if you go to this particular page, you can learn about how to do it, the census records that exist, census substitutes, vital records. There's all sorts of links as well. So definitely worth examining. The other that is very similar is the Family Search History Wiki. And this works kind of like Wikipedia. So some of the pages are done better than others, but it's an excellent resource for finding information about record collections that are available at the Family History Library, but also other things that can help you with your research process. So here's just an example, and this is something that we use all the time in research services, is help with some foreign handwriting. So there's, if you're trying to read some old German script, the A might look like this, or it might look like this, or it might look like this. It just depends on what record collection you're looking at. But this can help you to figure out, if there's something hard to read, this can help you to navigate that process. It's an excellent resource with a bunch of links as well. And then I don't have to tell you because you're listening to me talk right now, but another thing that you should always be looking at is the webinars that we put on, that NEHGS does, the how-to videos, webinars, and lectures that we have that are available for free, and then also the courses that we have available for purchase. We've explained how to do a whole lot of genealogical research over the years, so definitely something to keep track of. And then help you to decide if you can find a record collection that will help you to expand your cluster research studies. So once you've gone through that, you've looked at Wikipedia, you've looked at the Family Search Wiki, you've looked at the American Ancestor subject guides, you've listened to some webinars, you want to add those relevant records to your research log. So if we're looking for Elizabeth Brown, and we know that she's born in 1830. What I did was I looked at the Illinois Vital Record Wiki on Family Search, and that tells me that the earliest record recorded in Illinois was 1877. So it's very unlikely that we're going to find a birth record for Elizabeth. So I don't have a citation there. Now the marriage record, on the other hand, they got married before 1849, probably in Illinois. According to the Family Search Wiki, the earliest record recorded would be when the county was formed. So that's good news for us. So we want to be looking at this Illinois County Marriage Database. And I want you to do that for every record that you're trying to find. So if you want to look for a will, it's going to be in this Wayne County Probate Collection at Family Search. These are the film numbers that I want to look at. If you're looking for an obituary, it should be at the Wayne County Public Library. If you contact them and you're waiting for a response, I always suggest looking or including the date that you contacted them, just so that you can follow up with specific information should they not respond to your request. So once you've done all this work, then you finally get to have some fun and do some research. So step 6 of this research process is research. And you guys know how to do that, so you're in good shape. So once you've identified everything, you go through the research process. And once you've done that, then you're going to update all your findings. In this case, when I was looking for Elizabeth Brown, I didn't find anything that was relevant. So that's why in this relevant record column, everything basically says no, except for the original record that we found in Buckeye Cemetery. That doesn't mean that she's an open and shut person and we're done, we're not ever going to look at her again, because we might eventually along the way find information that will lead us to more about Elizabeth. But at this stage of the game, we're going to move on to the next person. When you're updating your findings, it might be helpful for you to make notes on your research log indicating how reliable a record is. And this is something that is entirely up to your judgment. So if you think, I'm looking at a record and it's not an original, it's a copy. So like that transcription that we had for Emmanuel Brown, that is not the original. It is typed out. It's definitely a copy. So the original would be better than the copy. So in your notes field, you should say it's a transcription or it's not the original. You want to also think about, especially if there's a problem. So if you're looking at a record and you're like, wow, this is not anything like what I know about my ancestor. That's when you want to make a note about it. So the individual reporting the event. So in the case of someone getting married and they're providing the names of their parents, that information is coming from them. If they are dying and there's information provided on their death record, that is not coming from them. So in those cases, they might not be as reliable. So the marriage record is probably more reliable than the death record. Same goes for how close the event is to or how close the record is to the event. So if it's a tombstone that gives a birth date, that might be problematic. The other thing to think about is, how educated is this clerk? Like this might happen when you're looking at like census enumerations. we do the census every 10 years. That means you can't be a full-time census taker. You probably had another job in addition to that. So just something to keep in mind. And then also the reliable source versus an uncited source. So if something's cited, if you're looking at a published genealogy and there's many citations and footnotes, that's probably going to be more reliable than something that's uncited. Fine. And then step 7, once you've done all of these steps and you've done your research and you've updated everything and you wrote it all down, then you're going to come to your conclusion. I want you to, before you start the whole process, to set limits for yourself. Say to yourself, if I stay organized and I look at all of these people that are in this cluster, and I'm going to write everything down the entire time, then I can stop. And you want to trust yourself that you've done all of the research that there is to do. I want you to be creative, but don't be crazy. So don't start looking at like the associate of the associate of the associate, because that'll get a little nuts and you probably won't figure it out based on that. And then I want you to set some realistic goals for yourself. So just as we did with Elizabeth's birth record, we're saying, well, they didn't start birth records until 1877. She's born in 1830. What's the likelihood of us finding that? Probably not good. It's probably going to be somewhere else. It's not going to be an official birth record. It might be a baptism. It might be in a family Bible, but it's not going to be in some of those civil records. And then if you do a cluster study that's crazy, that's looking at all sorts of different people and relationships, and the reason that that everyone's related is because of this really tangled web of folks, then I want you to create a research summary. And this is what a research summary looks like. It can be very short. I just want you to, and there's a few parts that go into a research summary. You're clearly stating your objective. You recognize the earlier scholarship that exists, if that is a possibility. So if you see many online family trees, or if you see in a published genealogy that they're giving parents to a particular person, but you think it's wrong, you're going to identify that. You're going to give a research summary, which is what did you find, what didn't you find. You address any mistakes in the process or anomalies. You suggest some alternative possibilities, which this suggesting alternative possibilities, that's always, you don't really want to do that. But if there are some out there, so there could be more than one John Brown with the same name and the same birth date, that's possible, but probably not likely. We still want to mention that. We want to come to a conclusion, and then we want to create a genealogical summary. So, John Brown is number 1, and he was married, born, died. This is the person that he married. And then the children would be listed after that. And once you put that together, then you can be fairly satisfied that you've done all that you can, to attack the research problem. All right, so to finalize everything that we talked about, I know there's a lot of steps, and this is a very lengthy process, but as long as you stick to the steps and you're very organized and methodical with your research process, you really can find a lot of information about your own family. When I started putting these together, so putting these presentations together, when I started looking at my own family, I missed stuff that when I was going through the methodical approach, that's when I started to realize, oh, I completely missed that other person that's giving us this hint. And now I know someone's maiden name. So I promise that this works, even though it can be time consuming and methodical. So the first thing we want to do, we want to organize our previous research into an annotated research log. Ideally, when you are actively researching your own ancestor, you should be creating a research log, because then you don't have to go back and do all that extra work to identify what should be included. I want you to look for missing information and identify your goal. There always should be a very specific goal. Parents, immigrant origins, mom's maiden name, whatever it might be. It's not, I want to find everything out about my ancestry. That's not really the best way of going about it. I want you to find the fan club or the cluster, whatever you like calling it. And then I want you to include everyone's name on that research log. Even if you don't attack all of them at once, we want to be sure that we're including them just so that we know to go back to them. List all the records that are going to help us with the research process. Locate where they are. So are they at the Family History Library? Are they at NEHGS? Are they on Ancestry.com? Do I have to call my local library? Wherever that is, you want to include that on the log. Finally, you get to do the fun stuff in research. And then once you get through that research process, then you're going to analyze and make your conclusions. I promise. Cluster research, again, so difficult. It's so rewarding when you finally figure something out, especially when you've been working on a brick wall for several years or decades. This process, it does work. It does, help you to discover more about your ancestor, even just the concrete stuff like parents and birth dates, death dates, and stuff like that. So I hope that I hope and wish everyone the best of luck going forward.
All right, well, thank you, Lindsay. Before we get to your questions, I want to let you know about our brand new Courses on Demand offering. If you'd like to take today's discussion a step further and see how this technique can be applied to, say, discovering your ancestor's parentage, Lindsay has created a short class that you can purchase using the link on this slide, which I will also include in my follow-up email. So certainly taking today's lessons a step further and going through a more rigorous case study. All right, so let's get to your questions. I know that we're just about at time, but we do want to answer a few questions before saying goodbye for the day. So, Lindsay, a few questions about kind of why would you use a spreadsheet? And in this case, you used an Excel spreadsheet. Why would you use a spreadsheet to organize this versus, or this type of research versus, say, a genealogical software program, or an ancestry tree, or something that maybe you already have?
Yes. So if everything that I said to you makes a bunch of sense, and you're thinking, this would be so much easier if I just did it on Ancestry or on my reunion account or whatever, that's totally fine. If that makes more sense to you, that's fine. What I have noticed over the years of being in research services, and really what we do on a daily basis is doing cluster research, because no one hires us to find someone on the 1920 census. They find us to do very rigorous genealogical work. And what we found is when we use the spreadsheet, and it doesn't need to be Excel, it can be any spreadsheet program that you have access to. When you use Excel, you have so much more flexibility. So you can create more columns if you want to, or you can sort lists based on birth date, or you can search it. All of that is a function that I don't really feel like those online, like a genealogical software program can provide. It doesn't provide that that functionality. So you can filter on Excel. So it's a way that has worked for us in the past. It makes sense to me from a organizational standpoint. It also forces you to do everything. So if you were to put things on your ancestry tree, or if you were to put things in your genealogical software program, you might not notice when you have some of those hanging people. So like when you put people on the tabs and when you put information on the Excel sheet, that you skipped a step and you weren't totally honest with yourself by being organized. So when you see those people, you say, oh man, I didn't look at that person yet. So that's not as obvious, I think, when we're using some genealogical software programs. I think Excel just makes it much more obvious that you've missed something.
All right, thank you. And Devora asks, so when you're looking at people with the same surname, and the example that you gave, you were looking for Browns, I think, in the Buckeye Cemetery, and Brown is a very common last name. But when you are looking for kind of the cluster and you're going by a very common surname, do you do you really include everyone with that surname in your research log? Do you set any kind of limitation out front? Because she's asking about, say, her ancestor's surname is Cohen, and that she's bound to find lots of Cohens in a Jewish cemetery. How do you include everyone, or do you start to prioritize that list as you add it to your research log and plan?
Well, that's going to depend. So in the case of the Browns in Buckeye Cemetery is not a giant cemetery. It has about 300 people buried there, I believe. So if there's 11 of them buried there, great. We should be looking at all of them. If you're looking at Calvary Cemetery in Queens, New York, if you put in any surname, you're going to find at least 20 people. So in that case, that's probably not the best approach. The best approach then would be who is close to your ancestor. So we want to be looking in a plot area. So, and that area can be fairly large. One of my ancestors is buried in Calvary Cemetery. There's millions of people buried there. The family owned plots that were fairly close to each other. I mean, in the perspective of, there's a million people buried here, I could throw a baseball and hit one of the tombstones, but it's not exactly close. In that case, we want to be thinking about who's in the same plot, or maybe who's in the same section, and not the whole giant cemetery, because that will definitely be overwhelming. So I think the important thing to keep in mind is just the functionality of the research that you're doing. So if you have to look at 150 names, that's probably not the best approach until we start getting desperate and we need to look at everybody. But you should start with that inner circle and then kind of work out. The same is true for a census record. If you find a household, you know that that's your family's household. When you start looking at the surrounding neighbors, I want you to look at like the page that they're on, and then the page before and after. So, and then you could maybe expand to pages beyond that. But I don't want you looking at like the entire town at the beginning, because that will definitely be overwhelming, especially when you have a common surname.
Thanks. And one of the suggestions you made was to also look at kind of the patterns of people's movement. So maybe people arriving in the town on around the same time period, or they're coming from the same place. So Carla asks, how would you identify people who arrived in a specific area, say in 1845, or in a given year or a given time period? Or what type of documents or resources would you go to find, to kind of seek out those patterns?
Right. So if it's 1845, what I would do first is I'd look at the 1850 census, and I'd look at, and hopefully they're moving to a place that is not in the same state. So if they're, if you're looking in Ohio and then your ancestors from New York, all I would do is look in that particular town for anyone else that was born in New York that's currently living in that town in Ohio. And then look at everyone's birth date and then see if there's any similarities there. Another thing that we like to look at is the grantee index for a particular county or town, depending on what state you're talking about. It just depends on how they're organizing their deeds. But the grantee index is folks who are purchasing property, usually, well, if they were first arriving there, that might be the first record of them in that particular area. So if your ancestor comes in 1845, I would look at, give or take, folks who are purchasing property in that same year. Again, depending on the county or the state, that could be a large number of people. So definitely figure out what makes sense at first. So is there a way for me to narrow this down before I start looking at 200 people? I think that's perfectly acceptable. The same is going to be true for, the grantee index is usually referring to state land or county land. You can also look, especially if you're looking in the Midwest, is to start looking at the federal land grants. So folks might be arriving in those areas because they were given a military pension for serving in a particular war, or they might just be buying federal property because there was cheap land at that point. So just other things to keep in mind, land records and tax records, those are usually the first two records that we find of individuals arriving in an area. The other thing to look at is the birthplaces of all of their children. That can kind of help you to understand a migration pattern. We worked on a project in research services for a client. Their surname is Niver, which is kind of an obscure-ish surname, and they went from New York to Pennsylvania to West Virginia to Illinois. And when we first found them, we thought that they had just gone from New York to Illinois. Well, they actually went down the Allegheny River, which is why they ended up in West Virginia. So we actually found other families that took that exact same migration pattern, and that's how we figured out where they were from in New York, just by using some census records to see, oh, they had kids that were born in West Virginia. So like in the middle of the household, there would be kids born in New York, one in West Virginia, and then everyone else in Illinois. And that would be a key indicator that, oh man, they probably did the same migration pattern as our Nivers. So that's how we figured out where they were from in New York.
All right, maybe just one more question. I know there are so many great questions and not enough time. Tom asks, and there were a few questions about this actually, how does DNA figure into this approach or into your research log? How do those results how can they be incorporated into cluster research?
So that's a really good question. We've done a few DNA studies in research services specifically, and then also many of the researchers on the team have had, their own dilemmas with using DNA. You can use it the same way. What you always want to be doing when you're performing, a look, really a deep dive into DNA results, is to look at the centimorgans that you have in common with a particular individual, because that will identify how close. So centimorgans are a measurement of how much DNA that you share in common. So depending on whatever that number is, you can have a good idea of whether or not your second, third, or fourth cousins, or especially if it's a closer relationship, that can help you if it's a half aunt or maybe a full aunt. There are charts that can help with that. I would just suggest Googling centimorgan relationship chart, and then you should be able to find something that will help you to identify what that relationship is. And all of the major companies allow for that analysis. So you could just set up your research log the same way. What will be different is that you don't necessarily know the name of the person that you're looking for. So you would be looking for, you'd be looking for grandparents. So you'd have to bring all of your research back in order to identify how someone might be related to you. But it's definitely doable. And we've done it before using just an Excel sheet. It does help to keep things organized. And again, searchable is one of the greatest features of it.
All right. Well, thank you again, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. I know we didn't get to everything today. If you do want more hands-on help with the specifics of your family history research, you might consider scheduling a consultation or hiring our research services team, and you can learn more about those services on the screen in front of you. I will also be including in my follow-up email a link to a few things, a link to the handout that you can purchase for this session. It includes lots of additional links and resources and finding aids that will certainly aid in your research. I'll also include a link to the annotated research log. So that template is freely available on our site. So I'll also include a link to that, and also a link to the course that I mentioned on finding parents using the cluster research technique and method, and creating and building a research plan to break down those brick walls. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback as we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings. Any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. And I also want to note that this free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and audiences around the world. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.